What we have here is a failure to communicate. Remember that old movie, that old line from that great movie called Cool Hand Luke? That was a movie in which Paul Newman played a convict who was put into a work prison, a work camp of some sort. Didn't want to be there, no surprise. So he escaped. And every time he escaped, he was brought back. That happened several times. And every time he was brought back, he was put in the hole. This was a hot box in the ground, and he had to sit there for 24 hours or more sometimes as his punishment for trying to escape. As the movie progresses and Luke keeps trying to escape, we get to a point where the warden is so frustrated after retrieving Luke yet again and throwing him in the hole yet again that he stands over the top of the hole, hands on his hips or arms crossed, something like that, sweaty guy looking down on top of Luke, and says the classic line of the movie, "What we have here is a failure to communicate." And we all knew as we watched that movie that they did not have a failure to communicate at all. The two were communicating incredibly well. Luke wanted out and the warden wanted him to stay, and they both understood that about each other. But sometimes in a workplace, we use that same kind of phrase. We have a failure to communicate. When maybe we don't have a failure to communicate. Maybe we just have a failure to agree, but we can't come right out and say it. We can't say, "I completely disagree. I thoroughly understand what you're saying, and you thoroughly understand what I'm saying. We utterly disagree." Now we have a conflict, and we have to work out the conflict. Instead, we often just gloss over it by thinking that it's a failure to communicate. So we try to say the same things over and over and over, louder or with slightly different words, until that person understands, with the thought that if they understand, that somehow they'll come to agreement. They'll see the light. Well, we're often called to come in and help organizations that have a failure to communicate. One of the first things we do when we try to understand what's going on there is it this? Is this a Cool Hand Luke situation? Is this a situation where I understand you thoroughly and you understand me thoroughly, and we just disagree, and we need to approach it like it's a conflict rather than it's a failure to communicate? It's very, very common. However, there are a lot of times when we are not communicating very well. Communication is a challenging thing. So if you are a leader or a manager or a supervisor in your organization, someone who's responsible for influencing other people, I want to share with you a small change that makes a big difference right away when you do it. A couple of simple ideas about how to dramatically improve your communication. Now, when you do this, that will mean that the areas where you have conflict will show up sooner and smaller, so you'll be able to manage them well. And you won't mask them or hide them under a veil of poor communication. This means then, of course, you have to be pretty good at handling conflict. If you're not good at handling conflict, if you don't know how to do it, if you layer all kinds of emotion over it and turn it into war instead of problem solving or innovation, it's likely that you'll just blame all of that conflict on poor communication. So let's get right down to the heart of it. We have in the workplace 3 different kinds of communication. Number 1 is what we call intentional communication. That's the kind of communication where I have something I want to communicate with you in such a way that you understand it, and I have designed that communication intentionally. Perhaps it's an email where I'm communicating something exactly the way I want to communicate it, in the way I want to communicate it. And I thought it, and I reread it, and then I sent it to you. That's intentional communication. Maybe it's a meeting where we get 11 of us together, and it's an informational meeting, or maybe it's a decision-making meeting, something like that. And we all know what this meeting is for, and we all know what needs to be communicated and understood, and we all know what needs to be decided. That is intentional communication. Maybe I'm going to call you on the phone. I set up a phone appointment for 12:30 in the afternoon, and you know when I call you what we're going to talk about. Or at least I'll tell you as soon as we start talking. Here's what we need to talk about. That's called intentional communication. We know what we need to communicate in advance of communicating, and we're very intentional about it. That is one form of communication. The second form of communication is incidental communication. Now, what I mean by that is that an incident occurs of some sort, and we all gather around to deal with the incident. And as we're dealing with that incident, we communicate about things that we likely would not have communicated about, certainly not in that way or at that time or with those people, had the incident not occurred. incidental communication. Could be something as simple as the internet goes down and we all need to gather around somewhere physically if we're in close proximity and say, how do we get this thing rebooted? Or an incident occurs where perhaps if you have someone you're serving, that's a customer, or if you're at a not-for-profit arena, maybe a donor comes in and is frustrated about something and it's an incident, and 2 or 3 or 4 of you gather around to deal with that frustration. But then as you deal with the incident, there's communication that happens around it that would likely not have occurred except for the incident. Often, by the way, that kind of communication happens after the incident passes. If it's a frustrated person and they come in, they're angry and frustrated, and then you deal with that frustration and then they leave, and then you turn to the person beside you and say something that you would probably not have said before. If I'd known this about that person, I never would have hired him, or something like that, right? Or I just hate my job, or something that you probably would not have communicated save for the incident. All right, that's incidental communication. Here's the third kind of communication: accidental communication. We actually just stumble across communication. We hadn't planned on it. There was nothing that prompted it. We just kind of stumbled across it. It was communication, in effect, by accident. And it could be something like if we're in the same space and I walk by and 2 people are talking about something that I'm interested in but had never even heard of before. This is interesting to me. I accidentally overhear the conversation. I inject myself into that conversation and say, all right, hey, what's going on? I did not know that. It's by accident. It could be something, I don't know, it could be something printed that's left out on a table in a meeting room, and you all leave and you leave it out there. And it's the budget for the next year or something like that. And someone accidentally sees that. Not that they shouldn't see it, but you hadn't planned on them seeing it now. You had planned on intentional communication, them seeing it later. I don't know, something like that. It's communication that occurs when I understand something and it was by chance that I understood it. Okay, that's called accidental communication. All right, so those 3 types: intentional, incidental, and accidental. Let's layer another idea over the top of this. Most of us as leaders trust intentional communication the most. And in fact, we only think of that when we think of communication. We're not communicating well around here. Well, I need to write better emails. We're not communicating well around here. Well, I need to publish a better e-newsletter or something like that. Or the bulletin board needs to be better. Or my phone calls need to be more frequent. We think of intentional communication as the only kind of communication. Typically, those of us as leaders do that. We also tend to think that when we craft that intentional communication very, very well, that once is all it takes. Because it's so good, it's as though I've descended from on high with tablets and I'm handing them out and everyone gets it and everyone understands it. Here are the 10 things I want to communicate with you. Well, we all know how well that went, right? So intentional communication is the one most trusted by leaders. The second thing I want to share with you about these 3 types of communication is that in times of great change, where we're pivoting, we're speeding up, we're slowing down, we're innovating, things are shuffling around and changing, and times, therefore, of a bit of uncertainty, it is accidental communication that is trusted the most. If a leader comes to you and intentionally communicates something, we'll call it A. They intentionally communicate A to you. But you accidentally hear B, and this is during times of change or transition or uncertainty, you will believe B more because it seems like it's less guarded. It seems like it's has less spin on it. It's not polished as much. We tend to believe accidental communication more than we believe intentional communication. This is a fascinating way to understand it. So realize that if you want to communicate well, you've got to be able to have communication that happens along all 3 of those, let's call them channels: intentional, incidental, and accidental. And when the communication, when the message, when the idea, when the challenge is the same across all 3 platforms, people believe it, especially in times of great change. All right, so there's a pretty simple background for you to get your mind around. Let me ask you a question. How can you dramatically improve communication in the workplace? That's how. I just did it to you. Right there. Right there. That awkward pause is how you set up to create really, really good communication. Create curiosity. That's the first step of 3 steps that you want to be able to take in order to communicate really well and to create a culture where communication is excellent in your workplace. Create curiosity. People will lean in, they will listen, they will understand, they will ask questions when they're curious. To try to communicate something to someone about which they have no curiosity at all is a waste of time. It's like you're trying to speak French to a Rottweiler and they have no desire to understand that at all. Okay? So, number 1, create curiosity. I'll tell you in just a moment the 5 things that folks in the workplace are the most curious about. So stick with me for just a moment. The second thing that you and I want to do in order to dramatically improve communication after we've created curiosity is to create accountability. That means that you set up communication in such a way that with one call, one click, one conversation, people can find out anything they need to know and then hold them accountable for knowing. Because we have put so much emphasis on communicating very, very well and making sure that everyone knows everything, we have taken as leaders, managers, supervisors, as influencers, almost all of the weight of responsibility for communicating on ourselves, when in fact that's a mistake. We need to make sure that what needs to be known can be known with one call, one click, one conversation, and do that well, and then hold people accountable for finding that stuff out themselves. If somebody comes to you and asks a question, or you're in a meeting and someone says, well, no one told me that, and the thing that they should know is available to them through one call, one click, one conversation, you need to pivot or tip the responsibility and accountability back on them. You are responsible for knowing this stuff. We are responsible for communicating it and making it accessible, but you are responsible for knowing it. We think of it this way in most organizations, that 30% of the responsibility of communicating comes from leadership. 70% of the responsibility comes from the people that they're communicating with. The responsibility for understanding and knowing, once the communication is created, is on the person, on the employee, on the team member. So, and not the other way around. So that means that you have to, here's our second point, you have to create accountability. You have to hold people that are part of your team responsible for knowing what they're supposed to know. And you get this. How many times have you been in meetings or in conversations with people and the people are complaining about not knowing something and about poor communication and they never even read the email? And the email is sitting there. They come back from their vacation, there's 38 emails, or some of you got 380 emails sitting there waiting for them. And I know it's a challenge to catch up with all that stuff, but you have to hold people accountable for actually accessing the good communication that you've created. Now, of course, it's another story. If you have not communicated well, if your emails are hard to understand and they're 17 scrolls long instead of 2.5 paragraphs, or you hide information under carefully crafted language so people can't understand it, well, that's on you. But if you communicate clearly and it's accessible by people, now you need to hold people accountable for understanding what's going on in the organization. And if they're not, they are not doing their jobs. This is a really, really big deal. We call that, by the way, creating a one call, one click, one conversation culture, where everyone is expected to know what's going on, assuming that you as leaders are setting up that information and the knowledge so that they can access it easily along the path of least resistance. All right, so there we have. Number 1, create curiosity. And number 2, create accountability. And number 3, this takes a little bit more work than what you might think. Create what I like to call salience. That might not be a word you use on a regular basis, but you sure experience it on a regular basis. Salience means something is particularly memorable. It's almost like the word sounds like what it means, right? Something that is salient is something that is very memorable. It's something that will stick. It's sticky. It'll affect my senses. It'll be easy for me to recall. It grabs my attention in some way. Typically, the way we do that is we create stories. Here's a short story, like a parable or a story, or we're referring back to something we did before, and we embed the story in what we're communicating. The story is the emblem of what we want to say, or what would the opposite of what we want. So we create stories. Another way to create salience is to make sure that there is emotion involved in the communication. It's totally appropriate to be emotional as a leader and not use emotions to manipulate. That's dumb. But to have the emotions and embed the emotions in what we're communicating, verbally, as well as through videos or through emails or whatever the case is, however you're sending that communication back and forth between one another. So you use emotions. That makes it salient as well. And the third way to make it salient is to help people understand what the threat is if they don't understand this communication or they don't do something about it, and what the reward is if they do. Remember, we have a threat and reward brain. So if the communication that's occurring creates curiosity, creates accountability, and creates salience, including, oh, wow, I need to know this or I'll lose out. That's a threat. I need to know this or that way I'll get what I want. That's a reward. Then you're going to be able to have really good and disciplined communication. So think about what you're communicating and think, does it meet all three of those points? So when you're back to that first point, when you're creating curiosity, how do you create curiosity? Well, wouldn't it be nice to know what people are curious about, what they want to know? Well, they want to know 5 things. They want to know what is their status. They want to know, how do I fit? Am I above or below this, or am I beside this? How do I fit? How do I show up in this regard? And the second thing they want to know is what's changing and what's not. They want to be certain about things. What things are certain and what things are being threatened by change in some way. They want to understand, are things going to be the same tomorrow? When we're experiencing a lot of change, they want to know what's changing and what's not changing. So they're always curious about this. Now, by the way, some folks are going to want to have some things stay the same, and so change will be experienced by them as a threat. Other people don't want things to stay the same. They need them to change. So if they stay the same, that will be experienced as a threat. Think about that for a hot second, and you'll be able to figure that out. So folks want a level of certainty, and they're always curious about something that threatens their certainty. All right. The third thing that they really want to know is, what's up to me? They're always curious about that. Well, what's up to me? What do I get to decide? What is totally up to me? What's partially up to me? And what is not up to me at all? And they're very curious about that. We call that autonomy. And the next thing they're very curious about is, who am I going to be working with? They want to know about the relationships. If work is arranged in such a way that I'm going to work with Biff over here, and Biff is horrible to work with, they're curious about that. Is it possible for me to work with somebody else? Or there's certain work that they're going to do. Are they going to be doing it alone, or is there going to be anyone else there to help them? They're curious about who they're working with. They're curious about relationships as it comes to work. Anytime you step in and communicate having anything to do with relationships, a new hire or work is being changed around in some way and they're going to work with other people, they're going to work with that certain customer or that certain group, they're very, very curious about that kind of thing. As rightly they should be. All right. And the last thing they're curious about is anything that has to do with fairness. They want to know if this workplace is fair. They want to know, really, is it just, even better than fair? Is there justice here? They want to know if they work really, really hard, will they be able to get more money or a better opportunity or a more flexible schedule? They want to know if they work really, really hard and that person over there is a slacker. Is there a sense of fairness that goes on in the workplace? So they're super, super curious about that. They're curious about all 5 of those things. Anytime you communicate with your team about any of those things or all of those things, they will lean in and they will want to understand it. You will be able to communicate well, especially if you make it readily available to them to understand, and especially if you make it salient when you communicate. That is memorable and it affects their senses in some way. All right? That's the stuff that people really, really want to know about. Okay, here's my last thought for you. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this video. The last thought that I want to share with you is this. Communication is exciting when you do it the first time and mind-numbingly boring when you do it the 19th time. Because it's highly likely that person A is curious right now about that thing you're talking about, and person B won't be curious about it for 6 weeks. And so you'll need to be able to communicate this over and over and over and make it available over and over and over. And people are like popcorn when it comes to their curiosity. These people over here will pop right away because they're very curious about something. That's where they are. That's what they're paying attention to. That same message won't hit with people until later. This person over here, when now they're ready and now they're curious. And the work in between that you as a leader or manager or a supervisor are doing as you are saying the same things over and over, asking similar questions, communicating the same messages over and over and over can be mind-numbingly boring. Here's another real challenge. You're probably a really good communicator the first time, but you probably lose patience and become irritable if you have to communicate it the third time or the fourth time. People aren't going to get it all at the same time and in the same way because of what they're curious about and when they're curious. So communication is at first fun and enjoyable, and then it just turns into a discipline. And there is no way around that. I don't think there should be either, but there's no way around that. There are no shortcuts to human communication. So dig in. Get disciplined about communicating. I hope this was very helpful for you. And if it was, hit that like button. You can also subscribe because we got a bunch of these that keep coming out. You know that by now. And you can hit that bell too, and that'll notify you when the next one drops. And they drop every few days, perhaps about once a week when these come out. So dig around, see if there's other ones you might like as well. Anyway, thanks for joining. It was great to communicate with you. And what we have here is not a failure to communicate.